Well, friends, we are joined here today with Justin McRoberts. And Justin, you are my second two-time guest on the podcast, so I feel like
Hey,
that's a pretty high honor.
I'll take that. That's a very high honor.
But I mentioned that to be able to say, I think the previous time I had you on is the podcast episode that I feel worst about my contribution to.
Sorry.
No. It had nothing to do with you. It's
That's who you
100% me. And now, like, that was the first time that we had met, and now we know each other a little bit more. So, like,
Yes.
I feel comfortable sharing this with you. That, like, I was learning how to do that. I feel like I'm still learning how to do this, but one of the things I didn't have the confidence to do was to ask for a copy of your book. And so it was every single time I've done an interview, I've read the entire book of Who I Do It With, except for that one with you. And
well, glad we fixed it this time.
we fixed it this time.
Good.
And so, like, I was like, so there's like a cactus on your cover. Can you talk about that some, please?
I feel like you did just fine. I feel like
So we get to redeem it here today.
amen and amen. Let's redeem it.
So the book that you've got coming out is called Sacred Strides.
Yes.
And we're looking at in a kind of the intersection of creativity and rest. Is that a good
Yeah,
way?
that'd be good way to talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so another confession as we get going. As I started, like, I was really excited about your book, and as I started getting into it, I had this like little bit of concern that started to get raised because of I have got some baggage around like a new Sabbath legalism that I feel like
Yes.
exists in some circles. So I want to talk to you
100%.
about that at some point.
Let's do it.
But before we get to that, I wanted to say, like, I actually really loved your book. And I
Thank you.
think one of the things that I loved about it was the starting point of it wasn't about like, oh, Sabbath is the thing that fixes everything that we need to all practice in a certain kind of way. But it was, to me, the way that I read it was Belovedness was at the
Yes.
center of the book.
Yeah.
And the idea of our work and our rest both flow out of belovedness.
Yep.
Yeah. Could you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I'm looking for the actual the way I read it down here in the book. That my natural posture is not work, nor is my natural posture rest. My natural posture is belovedness, and both work and rest spring from my belovedness and return me to it. It's the poem that's sort of the heartbeat of the book. The other way to say it is that my most natural way to be in the world is to be loved. And I get to practice that. In fact, I want to practice that in both my rest posture and in my work posture. It's it's sort of the third layer subtext to Jesus saying that the Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath. This is a commandment that's offered to you, given to you for your betterment, as opposed to like get it right. But yeah, it's about being loved.
And it's so fascinating to me, like how I'm kind of curious, maybe even first, like how you got to that point or that angle when you are like, did you start with trying to figure out the intersection of work and rest in your life, and that like as you dug down, you're like, oh, this is where it flows from? Or did you move towards a place of like being able to own your belovedness and walk in that, and you're like, oh, this stuff actually flows out of that?
Yeah, and what folks will pick up in the book is there's a bit of a journey. I mean, this like we learn things, and then we and then we unlearn and relearn and then unlearn and relearn, and it's sort of this like globular mess of learning. And so like I had hints of my belovedness earlier in my faith process, mostly in the context of work. Like what I was used to because of my upbringing was work. Like that's where your value is. And, we're all sort of tired of the cliche now. And I get it that like, well, you aren't what you produce. You can say that, but practicing that's a very different thing. So I still
Yes.
came through the doorway into my religious practice that was available to me. And that's part of it's part of how grace works, right? Is like, where do you need to be met? And I was someone who spent a lot of time on stage in high school doing theater. and other things. And that was the doorway through which I walked into faith practice. It was about participating. It was about contributing, and I found a very different experience of life and love in my faith context, in the context of work. Like working in the context of faith felt very different. It wasn't as performative. I was contributing to that bigger thing, that whole thing. And as I learned the thing, as I practiced work in the context of religion, what I started to come in touch with wasn't just like the satisfaction of work, but that there was something else there. Like I was touching something else. And that reframed my actual experience of rest, so that when I did get tired and started to take seriously these commandments, these disciplines about rest and Sabbath keeping, I started to experience that same connectedness,
Hmm.
that it wasn't like work does a certain thing and rest does this other thing. They were both taking me to this full experience of life. I reference Parker Palmer a ton in the book, and he talks about that hidden wholeness. That's what I was uncovering. Like I would do a work. There's a great chapter. Great chapter. This is one of my favorite chapters. It's this fantastic chapter. Everyone needs it. I just read this a couple of days ago. I was like, gosh, I love this story. But it's a story about traveling to Mexico, like really early in my faith journey, as so many of us did. I went to Mexico with a group of kids, and I was the song leader. And I was invited to not just lead songs in the morning and evening sessions, and then travel around and work alongside kids and meet all Doug's friends. Doug was the leader of the thing, but they stayed up. The leadership team stayed up all night the whole week they were down there. It was like very like aggro Christian thing, and I was like, I've stayed up for several days on end playing Halo, so I could probably do it for Jesus. And I super did. I got down there and worked my tail off, and prayed through the night most nights. And the kind of exhausted I was I was toast, and I was a very different kind of toast. Like I was exhausted, but I was really happy because I knew where my energies had been spent, and I knew what I'd contributed to, and I was in touch with myself, with God, and with the people around me in a very different way than I had been in the past. Which also meant that when I laid down to rest and I was done, that was a very different experience of rest. And in both places, I touched that hidden wholeness. I touched that hidden belovedness, and I wanted more of that. I didn't need more work. I didn't need more rest. I wanted more of whatever work and rest was getting me to.
I love that. Um, as a super tangent, was the trip that you're on, was it in Mexicali with like high school students that would come down and sleep in tents? And
100%. We went, yeah, we went
yeah,
to Doug had a trip. Doug Stolhan, he's still a pastor. He's up in Wisconsin now. He would take a trip every year to with students, but he was in Mexico like 5 or 6 times a year developing. He did the thing. I don't get into it in the book because this is not a book about short-term missions.
yeah.
But he did it really well because he was actually in relationship with the folks he was working with, including the cops. So there's the whole story there. But yeah, it was Mexicali, Mexico.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering. I used to take students on a trip that was associated with APU, with
Oh
the
yeah,
Azusa Pacific University down
yeah,
there, and it would be students from all over the country that would come down for. Anyways, totally random.
yeah. Thanks a
I
lot.
had wondered if like, oh, was Justin our worship leader that week that we were there? But so like with this, you were a traveling musician that
Yeah,
was going around and touring, and were you on like the CCM circuit? Were you doing all that back in the day a bit?
a little bit. I was
Okay.
peripheral to that.
Okay.
Like I was there. Even my label was a little bit kind of on the. We were edgy, and by edgy means we were less successful. I think
Tooth
it's
and
what.
nail.
Yes, it was. Well, we were actually less successful than Tooth and Nail, so we were actually edgy. And I think that's what we mean by edgy a lot of time. We're edgy. It means it's not going well. Yes, that's what I mean. Um, I was on a record label called 5 Minute Walk, so we were this like
Okay.
semi indie-ish label. It would be
Oh,
called indie now, but it's not really actually independent.
got it. All right. So you're traveling. You're a touring musician. You plant a church. You're a church planter. Like you're doing this work of ministry, and I mean, I think it's really fascinating the way that like your experience in Mexico taps into this like deep thing in you that I think a lot of us who are engaged in work of ministry have that kind of experience at some point.
Yeah.
And one of the places that we see that lead for folks is to exhaustion, to burnout, to the work becoming the ultimate thing. And you end up with tons of people like pastors, but also people that are engaged in ministry beyond that, even as non-paid, non-vocational pastors, but just engaged in volunteer work with the church, parachurch, whatever.
Yep.
That and it's tapping into that thing, and then it sort of like moves to this other place where it actually
Yes.
starts damaging your
Yep.
souls. Like, how do we distinguish between like here's this like really beautiful thing that's happening in me to
Yeah.
oh, it's shifted into something else?
First, I would read this book I just wrote. That's going to be helpful. That would be a big step because, and I actually do mean it because, the mistake I made is, I think it's a mistake. I don't want to say mistake. The thing I did, the thing I lacked a bit of wisdom, when it came to burnout. So I'll start there and then work backwards. So,
Okay.
burnout, like depression, it's not a positive thing per se, but it can be a gift. In other words, it's not just like this is this negative thing that just random shows up in your life. Depression, is, I mean, I love the way Jim Carrey says it. Jim Carrey says depression is your soul saying, I am tired of playing this character.
Huh.
Like you're being spoken to, like your soul is talking to you. There's more to depression than that, and I'm not belittling it, but part of what it means to get depressed, to be depressed, is you have to pay attention to your circumstances, your patterns, like what's actually going on that puts you in that place. So burnout can be a way in which it can be a moment of self revelation and realization, like what's actually at hand here. Um, in those moments, you need a guide. You need someone to catch you in that moment and not just help you get better, but help you understand like what is it, what's actually going on here. Because in my fortunate journey, I had folks help me contextualize that this wasn't, including Doug in that story, that the thing you're desiring here is a sense of being fully alive. Like, so if this job gets you to a sense of fully aliveness, fantastic. But like, don't become dependent upon the thing, which is that's the line that we often cross where we go deeper into burnout. We ignore the moment where like our burnout or our sadness points to the limitations of our dependencies. So you love your job, fantastic. It can grant you certain pathways, it can grant you certain experiences and unpack certain things in your life. But it's also really limited. And if you depend on that thing, if that's the thing you're chasing is success and execution, then that becomes an idol and it will betray you. But if through the doorway of your job you come in contact with and fall in love with the sacred beloved work of God in the world, that's a whole different thing. So it takes guidance, it takes coaching, it takes reframing those moments.
It's interesting. I had so many thoughts about my own experience, both like in the local church and my own experience kind of in some of my life stuff, like right now that I'm walking through. And one of the things I started processing a little bit more when I was reading your book was that one of the things that helped me in the way that when I left the church that I'd been at for almost 20 years, and in some ways, like there are all these people that we felt like we had poured into, and we realized, oh, these are non-reciprocal relationships.
Gosh.
And like that's just one of those things that like
Yeah.
you should know, but like I guess we weren't prepared for it in the way that it
Yeah.
kind of hit us and affected us, realizing that. And even as we tried to process that with some of those folks, the way that they responded to it made it very evident that like, oh, these
Yeah.
are non-reciprocal relationships. Anyways, one of the things that I began saying that had helped me to deal with it was I said, oh, well, what happened was at this religious institution, I was a purveyor of religious goods and services.
Mm.
And then when I was no longer doing that, I was no longer needed. They had a
Yep.
new purveyor of religious goods and services.
Yep.
And that was actually really helpful for me. It was a helpful thing for me in dealing with like some feelings of abandonment, of loss that of what I had thought were friendships, but were really non-reciprocal relationships.
Yep.
But I have found every time I have talked about that in a conversation with somebody, they're like saying like, this is a really helpful framework for me to understand this,
Yeah.
their response to me is like, oh gosh, that's really sad. Um,
Yeah, it's not sad. It's also not everything, right?
yeah, talk me through that a little bit. Give me like, a free like 3-minute coaching session here.
Sure. Well, because you're not wrong. I mean, like the way we'll talk specifically about the pastorate, but but this is true of a lot of life and a lot of our work relationships in general. Is the relationship is predicated on usefulness. It's predicated on utility. One of the things I go after in the book is I talk about utility a lot.
That's what
Is
got me thinking about this.
and a lot of our relationships are predicated on utility. What can you bring to the table? It's the doorway. I'm probably exaggerating. No, I'm not exaggerating. I'm probably like wrong statistically about this, but I'm going to say that the majority of relationships we're in are predicated on what one person or the other person can bring to the table, which makes it really important, first and foremost, to recognize that that's actually what's going on. And it's not bad. There's more to the relationship than that. But if the utility part isn't there, the relationship's going to go away. Um, that's just real. That's why folks show up. And I'll stay here for a second and say this. I totally get it. And you and I have talked about this. I totally get it that folks have been in church settings, religious settings, and felt used by church leadership. I totally understand that. And I'm not pushing back on that on the whole. I will say though, that the most used people I know are pastors. You've been getting used, especially if you think you're developing all these actual relationships. No, folks actually came because you have something to offer them. And if you can't offer that to them anymore, you're not going to have that relationship. It's such a rare moment in which like a pastor hits a wall, trips up, and like the same community they're serving rallies around the lead them back to health. That's super rare. So it is an unfortunate, I think, but also like pretty fundamental reality of our social sphere. That said, all the more reason to have altitude on that job and not over identify with it.
Yeah.
Because, well, and that's what Sabbath keeping can do is if I can pull 52 days of the year off the calendar and not be these people's pastor for a day, but simply practice being loved and cared for by the God who actually holds all things together. If I have the altitude on that and I recognize who I am in my belovedness, it helps as I'm disappointed and as I'm injured. It's like as these things go away, I'm not so rooted in my identity as a worker bee that when these things disappoint me, I'm dragged down into the doldrums as deeply. It still sucks. It still hurts. It's still a way the machine works that I wish it didn't. But there are ways to actually go about doing that job that don't lead you into the dumps when things go sideways. And practicing the Sabbath helps us have the altitude to do it in a more in a healthier posture and a healthier pace.
Yeah. I mean, I see you pushing into the Sabbath there. We'll get there
We'll
in a
get there.
second. Yeah, we'll get
Yeah.
there. I wanted to ask first, like this made me wonder if is this something, because I know like some of your work now is in coaching creatives,
Mhm.
and do you feel like this is a unique issue to creatives, and whether that's like however you define creative, and but people who
Mhm.
understand their work that way, where they're almost like when you see your work in that way, you feel like you're bringing your whole self to it in
Yeah.
ways that even like it's why the critique of the thing that you're doing as a creative can, if you're not in a healthy place, feel super personal.
I think I would take a half step back from
Okay.
it being a thing that's unique to creatives. I think the way the way the arts and ministry work tend to be pitched to people, it tends to set us up for a little bit more of a like a deeper or more comprehensive experience of the thing. I think everyone gets there. I think any person you talk to who's like at least into their 40s, maybe late 30s, has looked around and realized like a lot of my relationships are like that are about utility and I don't have any real friends. A lot of folks have been through that.
Okay.
But over identifying with one's work, that's part of how the job gets pitched to us. I mean, you and I both know cats who like they went to private school, a religious school, as a child, and then by the time they were 15, they knew they're supposed to be a pastor. And it's not like that's a job they wanted. That was like who I'm supposed to become. And
Yeah.
then they spend the next 15 years working to get to that place. And they're so deeply rooted in not just like, this is a job I want, but this is the person I want to be. Um, because it's pitched as an identity, it's more problematic when it goes sideways. Same thing with the arts. Is like, I am a songwriter. You write songs, or I am an author. Yeah,
Hmm.
you write books. It tends to be more problematic because of the way we talk about those vocations.
Yeah. Um, I want to be really quick to point out to folks that are listening that this isn't a book for just people who are in ministry. Like that just happens to be my experience and vantage point that I was reading it
Totally.
through, right?
Yeah.
It's much bigger than that. So to talk about Sabbath for a minute, here's been one of my sort of visceral reactions around my experience of what the Sabbath conversation has become.
Yeah.
Is I feel like there has been a Sabbath legalism that has sort of resurfaced in some circles, particularly, and I feel very immersed in the spiritual formation community. Like that, formation is really important to me, and
Hmm.
so I'm probably even more aware of it because it's very
Yeah.
much in that community, especially around some more puritanical movements within that community.
Hmm.
And my read on the Sabbath has been that there's something significant about a created order that creates intentional rhythms of rest and of restoration and rhythms of producing.
Hmm.
But that the Sabbath was commanded during a time that was an agrarian culture that
Hmm.
operated very differently. And one of the things that we'll often point out about today is that, like, oh, you're hyper connected and you like, so it's harder to take breaks. My
Yes.
counterpoint to that is often, yeah, but when Sabbath is commanded, there was not 40-hour work weeks. There was not paid vacations. There was not paid sick days. There was not, there was not 2-day weekends. Like, we actually have built into the structure of our society more space for rest and rhythm than we did before.
Yep.
And so the concept of Sabbath still matters, but the like this 24-hour period that was needed in agrarian cultures that still needed today in the same sort of way. So I give all of that because for you, my read was a 24-hour period is still really significant to you.
Yes.
So with all of and I did not experience the kind of thing in your writing that I've experienced in some other people's writings around that that felt like it almost made me feel like there's some folks in their writing that make you feel like you are living a second class life if you are not doing this thing,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
We're all selling a product. I'm
yeah.
a purveyor of religious goods and services. There it is.
So I didn't experience that with you. So anyways,
Good.
I say all of that to just give a little context to like I would be curious to hear you like riff on that a little bit.
Absolutely. And I don't think you're wrong. I think specifically when you talk about building in 2-day weekends and what have you, like yes, the culture works very differently. The question ends up being, do I actually take advantage of that? Right? Do I actually take advantage of that? Or do I do the thing which I have in the past where like Saturday provides a different opportunity for different kinds of work.
Mm.
And Sunday, especially if you're a religious, if you're a purveyor of religious goods,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or a pastor or something like that. Sunday's a work day. Saturday's a prep day for your work day. Like, yes, it's built in, but do we take advantage of the opportunities given us? Which is the heartbeat of the Sabbath, the way I understand it. I am not a theologian. I'm not, which is the thing you say right before you say something. Top theologian. Is the heartbeat of Sabbath. I mean, you get back to that thing people point out when Jesus says the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The heartbeat of the Sabbath is the way it shapes me internally and the way it shapes my life. It's a practice that's intended to posture me so that I can receive the love of God and offer the love of God through my life to other people. So just like any other it's different, and it's different than the other disciplines insofar as like it's right there in the list of commandments before killing people. Like it shows up before murder, which is
Yeah,
shocking.
But it's the only commandment that's not carried into the New Testament as a command.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
Um, so insofar as it's different in that way, it's not different in this way, that the intention of the practice is the shaping of your life. So the question ends up being for me not like, well, has culture changed? Yeah, absolutely, culture's changed. Are you taking advantage of the opportunities? Like, what's it look like? Are you intentionalizing your rest, or are you just assuming that because you took off an extra hour on Thursday that you got the rest you needed? What
Yeah.
the Sabbath does is invites us into an intentional like attention paying to your own soul. Like, are you getting what you need from the world around you? Are you getting what you need from yourself? Are you getting what you need from Christ? I'm gonna venture a guess that for a lot of us who haven't intentionally asked that question, the answer is gonna be no. Like, I'm not getting from God what I need. Totally get that. What you think you need. Well, let's put you in a position to actually pay attention to that and intentionalize that practice. Because just because the time is there doesn't mean I'm taking advantage of it. That's the heart of Sabbath. I would suggest as a commandment, as a practice, and why it's still necessary, and why the specifics are necessary. Not so that it's a target you're supposed to hit. If it's not 24 hours, it doesn't count. That's not what I'm saying. But if I don't give myself parameters with any practice, then I don't really do the practice. So if I'm going to practice, let's say I'm going to do something like centering prayer, like I'm going to try 2 minutes, right? And if I don't hit 2 minutes, like that's okay. But I'm actually practicing if I try to hit 2 minutes and then try to extend that to 5 and then try to extend that to 20, right? So I have to have like a way that I'm going about trying to practice this. So that's why like the particulars of 24 hours, like that kind of thing matters. It makes it an actual practice that I can attempt with some
Hmm.
framework.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate like the idea of the forced intentionality around it
Yeah.
um, matters a lot, because I totally get and have experienced exactly what you're saying, that days off are not necessarily restorative if there's not an intentionality around that. And there's something that you wrote that was really helpful for me around that. You distinguish between rest of like obligation versus joy in
Yeah.
rest.
Yeah.
And kind of making a list of like
Yeah.
what am I doing because I'm obligated to do, and what am I doing
Yeah.
that's bringing joy. Like that was a helpful framework for me, I think, in
Yeah.
thinking
And
about that.
that's a self-learning piece where like, you and I are both well into our 40s, and we know like we like
You're more
yeah,
well into your 40s than I am.
I'm way well into my 40s. I'm almost 50, son. So, but like learning myself, like to have the humility as a person, particularly as a person of faith, to pause regularly in my life to evaluate again, am I getting what I need with regards to like rest and care? And so one of the questions ends up being like, in terms of rest, do I know what actually makes me feel rested? Or is it enough for me to just get away from work? Because that's okay. I totally understand that impulse. I just need to get away from work. That's fine. But rest as a practice has to be, I would suggest, much deeper than just divorcing yourself from things that cost you your time. Are you in touch with your own joy? Are you in touch with like what makes you feel loved and fully alive? That's actually a practice of rest. I tell this story in the book about like there are ways to rest poorly, and the anecdote is that I was flying to Germany, and I'd done international travel before, and I know like there's that almost whole day once you get on the other side, and like time equilibrium, you're all jacked up. And I was going to fix that problem by being really well rested by the time I got to Germany. So I stayed up the whole night before, got on an airplane, slept for 11 hours against the window on a Lufthansa flight, got off the plane in Germany, and picked up my bag and threw my back out because I had slept all like super crooked. And then for like the first 3 days I was there, I couldn't stand up straight. I couldn't get out of a chair. I had to go see a chiropractor in Germany, which is a terrifying proposition. Um, but there are ways that we rest that actually long-term malform us. It happens all the time. Like folks who like bounce, they count on their that one 10 day to 2 week vacation. Like that's going to get me there.
Yep.
And what happens, we go on that 10 day or 2 week vacation and we come home. And first and foremost, like it's probably not long enough to actually get us into like to actually detox us from our bad patterns. We just barely get in touch with like, oh, there's a deep breath. Oh, there's some joy. And then we have to go home. And then home is a place we resent. And our workplace is a place we resent even more so. So now I have more resentment towards my regular life. And where life is for me is on a beach in Tahiti. And I've malformed my own soul to have like all this like to have what's the word I'm looking for, to have animosity towards the actual life I'm living, whereas a real practice of rest, true rest, brings me to an appreciation for and a love for my life as it is, as opposed to does that. So there are ways that we can rest that actually malforms our life.
I love that. And that idea that like good rest, true rest causes you to love the life that you have rather than
Amen.
that's such a helpful framework. And even like that experience of vacation, I was thinking about, I do some sabbatical coaching with pastors,
Yeah.
and they'll get this gift, a beautiful, wonderful gift that I wish everyone could have of, a 3, sometimes 4 month, sometimes even a little bit longer period of rest from work. And the the majority of pastors I know that head into that almost like limping, I need this sabbatical.
Yeah.
And they come out of it and it's often like, oh, that wasn't long enough. I needed more, because they were heading into it
Yes.
it was with a vacation kind of mindset. Like, and
Yeah.
this is going to be the thing that's going to fix. I've been burning out. I've been doing really unhealthy rhythms and practices in my life.
Yep.
I'm probably not centered and grounded and
Yep.
working out of my belovedness. And I'm going to take 3 months and that's going to fix it. And it doesn't fix it.
Yep. Well, and you can hear both things happening in there, right? One is like you don't clearly you didn't know how to rest, and so it's like you're the guy who shows up at the gym after not being in the gym for 2 years,
Hmm.
and you're just freaking throwing weights around, and then you come out of the gym and you're there for 6 hours to make up for all the time you haven't been going to the gym. You're like, I'm in pain. I think I'm bleeding on my nose and in my eyes. I don't know what happened. You're like, you're bad at that because you don't practice it. And
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
you'll know as a coach, part of what makes I'm going to come close to using the word. I'll say the word necessary here, but I don't mean it in the legalistic sense. But part of what makes a practice of rest, a Sabbath keeping, necessary is that when those, specifically as a pastor, is that when those opportunities are actually granted us, I'm familiar first and foremost with what rest feels like. I know what it feels like, so that by the time I'm heading into a 3 month, 4 month, gracious, that sounds fantastic, sabbatical, I know what I want to go get. And once I go there, I know, again, like just like going to the gym, like I'm just not going to go over and deadlift because that's bad for my body. But I am going to spend time on the treadmill and this, like, you know what it is you want. The other thing it does is, and you can hear this is the second part of the framework, is if your work is a thing you have to just get away from, and if that's enough, like first and foremost, your rest is now totally like everything in your life is now predicated. Like your work is like the monolith. It's not your well-being. Your work is the monolith, and it's dictating what you mean by rest.
Huh.
In both, like if you don't love your work, let's fix that first before we just say like, well, periodically you just got to get away from this awful thing that you have to do and just get yourself well so you can go back to it. Let's fix this problem you have with your relationship with work. Can you feel fully beloved as you're doing your work? Let's actually get that work done instead of just get you away from this big monster as if work's a bad thing you have to do.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. I was thinking when you were talking earlier about like us both kind of getting into our 40s and you just start to learn different things. One of the things that I've realized in paying attention to what's restorative and rest for me is that there's all these like little almost contextual things that matter for me within something. So like a friend and I were talking recently that like watching a movie is restorative, but not just watching a movie. Like I've learned, oh, it's actually really helpful because now I can watch a movie and I can pause it and I can go do something and come back, or I can have my phone on me and whatever, right? Because I can watch a brand new movie in my living room. it's actually like watching a movie without interruption. And it's actually even more restorative to me when the room can be dark. And that there's like all these like little contextual clues that I've started to learn to pay attention to, that it's like,
Yes.
10 years ago, 15 years ago, I'd have said watching a movie is restorative. But I've learned like, it's actually not. It's like
Mm,
the whole context around it makes a difference.
yes. Yeah. And that's such a great, I mean, it's a thing you do, and then pay attention. And then once you pay attention, you can do the thing more deeply, like
Yeah.
the practice of like pausing, which is again one of the gifts of like a thing like the examine as a prayer,
Hmm.
or the Sabbath as a regular pattern, is giving yourself moments to stop and pay attention to the life you're actually living. First and foremost, to like appreciate the remarkable gift it is to be alive at all, but secondly, to pay attention to moments like that, and know like this is actually what's up, as opposed to like I just like movies. No, there's more going on there, and if you give yourself time, you can look at that and be like, it's actually this that I like about movies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right, can we I had written down this note and I don't have context to it, but maybe it'll make sense as we start talking. I
Let's
wrote
try.
talk to Justin about retirement. So here's
That's a great question.
um and like let me set up a little context for folks here to say that you and I were supposed to record this a few weeks ago. We are having crazy storms in California
Yes.
and my power got knocked out. So you graciously have rescheduled. So I wrote this down a few weeks ago, knowing full well, oh, this is what he was talking about that made me think of this. But so let me give my like little 2 minute kind of like
Yeah, go.
retirement rant. That's like my Sabbath rant. And
I'm in. I'm so in.
I think that there is this bill of goods that we are being sold of this movement towards, like, you're trying to move towards this golden era where someday you can get to the point where you can do all the things that you want. And
Mhm.
so you're doing this work that you put up with in order to get to this point when finally your life can be freed up to do all these things you want. And it bothered me for a while, that sort of like mentality. And I started like through my church and through people I had relationships with, I was hanging out with people that were entering into retirement, and the kind of like focus they would have around like, I've got 2.5 more years. And it was like, so, I was like, gosh, it just sounded so sad to me and so uninspiring.
Yes.
And like, what, like, so now I get to golf all the time or whatever. So I had sort of that piece. Then I had experiences with folks that were like essentially saving up experiences for when they could get to that point, who were not able to do those
Hmm.
experiences because of health things that happened there, because of and so felt like they're missing that.
Yep.
So we had taken an approach, my wife and I, that we had not really talked to people about because we felt like this is against all the money advice that you get and whatever, where we essentially said, we really value experiences with our family right now. And so we are going to forego some of the way that we would save for retirement with the
Amen.
with the thinking that like we will figure out, like, I'll probably end up working longer as a result of that, but we will forego that in order to be able to do things as a family now that we might not be able to do then, and we would rather
I love it.
like but that doesn't make sense in sort of like American ethos. um so there's something like in the way that you were talking in your book about stuff that like sort of keyed that thing in me. And I just kind of was curious to,
Yep.
I don't know, to bounce that off of somebody who it seemed like maybe would have some room for that kind of thinking.
I resonate 100%. And what you I would say, if we were in a coaching session, let's say I would say to you, let's say that we were coaching, that you are paying attention to a good desire, just like everyone is paying attention. The folks who are like, at some point I'm going to get to do all these things that I really like doing, but for the time being I've just got to bust my ass and get through this thing so that I can get to where I want. That desire is the desire to live fully. That's what we're feeling. It's what you're in, like, that's a good desire. The retirement plan is just a lesser plan. It's a lesser plan because it doesn't give enough. It first and foremost, it doesn't give enough credence and credit to the desire of your soul that's speaking to you right now. Because what your soul is saying is, hey, there's more to life than what we're doing right now. And your plan, and then our response is like, totally, we'll get to that later.
Hmm.
And I think instead it's the soul saying, no, this is the shape that I'd rather, I would exist more freely if our life was shaped this way. And so, like, the shape we give the whole life is you work, and then you have retirement, and then you die. Like, that's the shape. You have this work life, you bust your butt, you jump through all the hoops, and then you have this little space at the end of retirement and happiness and peace, and then you die. Like, that's the shape. And you're talking about a completely different shape of like, this, we're going to do this now. We're going to take this time now, and it's not going to be this work, and then it's going to be where there's time to work, and then there's seasons to rest and get away, and we're going to spend some of that money now, and it becomes this, again, this more organic kind of patterned shape, as opposed to the block of time where you just spend yourself and then die. So it's the same desire. It's just a really bad plan. Retirement oftentimes is a bad plan because, again, it malforms our expectations for what rest is, and we're not ready for it when we get there. And it makes work the enemy.
Yes.
Work is this thing. It's one of my favorite aspects of having written the book, is that what I hope folks do is walk away from the book with an appreciation for work, and appreciate, like, again, I'm not a theologian, but we really do lack a sufficient or broad enough theology of work. Like, we don't appreciate work as a gift and as an expression of who we are, and an expression of belovedness. It's one of the things I get to when I initially started writing the book. I was like, I'm going to do a book on rest and Sabbath keeping. And then, no joke, like, the more I wrote, the more I came around to these stories about, like, oh my gosh, that time in Mexico, that trip to Germany, and like, or like tour life, and like how much I loved work, and really recognizing like, I need to tell stories about how much I love what I do and why it is I get to continue to love what I do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So the retirement plan makes work the bad guy, and that's part of what's awful about it.
Yes. Well, and yeah, it does. And it's actually really hard to live in this other way within a cultural current that pushes against that. That,
Mm-hmm.
like, you're connecting with a financial advisor and you're trying to explain to them like your thoughts about retirement, and they have no category for it, and they just keep defaulting back into like, well, what age do you want to retire and what kind of lifestyle do you want to have then? And I was like, well, that's not the conversation I want to have. Like,
No, I want to
there's
live. I want to live now.
it, and it
Yeah.
feels, if I talk to, a part of why we don't talk to people about it is because it feels like we're saying something that's reckless, and that
Yes.
it's like in the same way of saying like, well, what if at 70, if I'm saying, what if at 70 I can't do those things, or I can't do them with my family,
Yeah.
then you're also saying, well, what if at 70 I can't work and I can't make enough, and then I become a drain on my kids having to take care of me, or whatever,
Yeah.
that we don't have the finances set aside to do whatever needs
And
to.
those are warnings that are worth paying attention to, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I think so.
I totally get that. There are other warning signs that are also worth paying attention to, like the depression rate among children would be one of those things. And some of that is because their families are living in patterns in which they're constantly isolated. They don't get the kind of time with mom or with dad, or the depression rate among like young adults or even adults. Like, that's a thing to pay attention to. We're not living as a whole. I don't make broad cultural statements a whole lot, but I will do this one. As a whole, we're not living patterns that actually invite and celebrate actual whole and human health. We make plans for the long term in which, like, at some point I'll get to be happy. And like, it's like it's I've got that song, oh my gosh, what's that song, that 60s jam about the kid who's trying to get time with his dad, and his dad keeps telling him, we'll do it
Cat in the
tomorrow.
Cradle. Yep.
Cat in the Cradle.
The
Like,
like
it's
make every
literally
dad feel terrible song. Yeah.
and there is something to that, though. I mean, like,
Yeah.
I get that. Like, I talk about my dad in the book, and I talk about losing my dad to depression and suicide, that was predicated on this very narrative, that you work for a while, and his dominant value was his ability to provide. right? He's not entirely wrong about that, but in terms of provision, I would have loved for him to be able to provide his presence to my children. And he doesn't get to do that because he spent himself doing what he was doing before. So the narratives we live in, specifically around work and what it's supposed to do, we're hurting ourselves regularly, and the signs are popping up left and right. We have to change the plan. And I like your plan of saying, like, I think we're going to take this shape and actually just and move it in closer to where we are now. We're going to have those experiences now while we know we want them, and while we know we can actually get them. I think that's highly responsible.
I appreciate that. That's what I'm going to tell everybody from now on.
Amen.
When they tell me I'm irresponsible. Justin
McRoberts.
said I'm being highly responsible,
Oh,
actually. Bro, this is so good. I think I could talk to you about this stuff for a long time. What have I not asked you that you wish we would talk about here? That I want to make sure that we haven't missed something.
Well, you and I could talk about that. Would be cool. You and I have talked interpersonally about, to go back to the pastoral aspect of things. It's a place where you and I have a lot of resonance. The impermanence of the job, and the impermanence of the thing. One of the pieces I get to in the book, and I'd love to hear you reflect on this a little bit, is I get to in the book that I thought when I was building my church community that I was going to build something that lasted. And it was an assumption I made. It wasn't the thing I thought. And then when it didn't last, it was awful. And it wasn't just, and again, this is stuff you and I've talked about. It wasn't just the interpersonal stuff, which was bad as it was, to be accused of things or blamed for things in terms of how the institution fell apart. But it was underneath all of it. Like, I thought, because of the nature of the thing, I built something that was going to last, and then it didn't last. And that really messed with my head. And one of the pieces that one of the places where I've been able to unpack that and find some healing and relief is, again, in the practice of rest, recognizing the impermanence of everything I make, recognizing and celebrating my limitations, and recognizing and celebrating the limitations of any and every cultural artifact I'll ever put together. The part of the glory and the value of the thing is its limitation, and that the limitations we put, just like the limitations we have in ourselves, the limitations that are innate to our institutions are actually part of their glory, and they're not part of the problem. It's not problematic that your church won't last.
Yes.
It's actually beautiful and necessary that your church won't last. And if you think you're building something that lasts, one, you're going to miss the glory of what it is. And two, you're not going to appreciate it while you're in it. And then three, when it's done, you're going to think you blew it, and you didn't. You made something for the moment, and that was awesome. And now it's gone, so let's build something else.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I have so many thoughts. I mean, one of them is, you talk about this some in your book, of the challenging what we mean by growth. And and I think that we in the church, we have adopted this mentality of things need to always be up and to the right. And we take something that is an organic experience, that the dominant metaphors for the church in the New Testament are all organic kind of metaphors, and we try to turn it into an inorganic kind of experience, that because nothing organic is always up and to the right. And we have definitions of growth that are entirely based around an economic engine mindset. That, like, the way that we think about growth of numbers of people, all that is all based around, the framework of it is an economic growth mindset that undergirds all of that. And not like when New Testament's talking about growth in believers, is talking about fruits of the Spirit, right? Like, are you more loving, joyful, peaceful, patient? So like, so I think like there's this undergirding structure, right? That we
Yes.
have unconsciously bought into that feeds some of that. I think that there's definitely that piece.
Yeah.
I
The section you're talking about, I said, Sabbath resistance. We talked this whole section about Sabbath resistance. Isn't so much a blanket critique of organizational institutional growth as it is a call to evaluate what we even mean by growth. It's a call to consider that if we think of growth, if what we think of as growth comes at the cost of well-being, that growth is likely cancerous and should be treated as such. So if what we mean by growth is costing us and other people their health or their well-being, like we're wrong, period, about
Yes.
what we mean by growth. If your definition of growth does not include the health and the well-being of yourself, the people you're working with and you're working with for right now, you're wrong, period.
Yeah, and how many systems of our churches are like have this constant turnover of volunteers because we have created systems. I mean, I remember we were doing Christmas Eve services when I first became senior pastor over multiple days, and I don't remember, we were doing like 7 or 8 of them, just like a ridiculous number. And maybe it was my second year as senior pastor. I heard a story about one of our musicians who was in between their music sets, like when I was preaching and stuff, would go into their car and wrap Christmas presents because they had rehearsals multiple nights in the weeks leading up to this. Then they were at church for almost all day on December 23rd, all day December 24th. And so they were having to cram in the a bit like Christmas present wrapping for their kids in like the
Dang.
holes around their volunteering at the church and I was like, this is ridiculous.
Mm,
And we actually changed then we needed to do I need is the wrong word. We chose to do still a
that's good.
number of services because of the number of people we had wanted to accommodate,
Yeah.
but we then changed how we did it, where we always did our Christmas Eve service started on the Sunday before. So it wasn't like, I think that particular year we had like Sunday was like the 21st or 22nd. So we had a regular Sunday service that we did and we were doing Saturday services so we had 4 services that weekend. Then 2 days later, we've got another 8 right? And we're just ripping through people. So we said that Sunday before is going to be Christmas services. And then
Mm,
we'll do some on the 24th also. No matter how it might be like the 19th and the 24th, they'll be super far apart, but we're at least
yeah.
going to like create a healthier rhythm there.
Yeah.
And I got the first year we did it, we did nothing on the 24th. And I think that would have burnt the church down if I kept doing that, which maybe would have been the good and right thing to do. I don't know. But anyway, like there was just so much resistance
Yeah.
to yeah, it's so hard to figure out ways that like, to value the health and wholeness of the people who are engaged in serving and caring for the church, around
Yeah.
to value that above the production of the church and production, not just of a Sunday service, but of all of what the church does.
And I think you point out a thing and I think you'll resonate with me on this when it comes to the long-term future, and I mean long-term, of church and the practice of church in our context here in the States. That moment in which you engage in what Harry Nouwen calls the ministry of disappointment,
Hmm.
um, is so vital that if you want to be a pastor, I'm just going to preach for a second. Like if you want to be a pastor in the long term, you got to learn to disappoint people. And not because not disappoint people because wow, I thought he was a nice guy and he super isn't. That's not what I mean. What I mean is if what we're doing is spiritual formation, then you will culturally incur the kind of resistance and pushback in a whole group of people that you feel in yourself when you're trying to get from 5 minutes of silent sitting to 20 minutes of silent sitting, and because your psychology is screaming at you, this is ridiculous, and you're getting pushback. But you've committed to this because you trust in the long-term formation of your own soul. So moments like that, when we say no to cultural expectations with which people come to church, that's part of what's going to make us healthy long-term.
Hmm.
That's part of what's going to make us healthy long-term is we're going to say, I can do this much and I can't do more than that. In fact, bigger than that, I won't do more than that because I want to still be here 20 years from now. And if you want to be framed, if you want to be shaped the way I'm shaped, if you want to follow me, then this is what it looks like. And if you don't, that's totally fine. You're gonna have to go somewhere else. And I've got a list of names of other people who are doing this. But like the capacity to say no to the cultural pressures, even to the demands of the people we're leading, that's going to be part of what it looks like to actually be healthy pastors long term. And we have to practice that, which leads me back to that thing that Mark Buchanan said at the very beginning, which is like, if you want to do what you love and love what you do long term, you have to learn to not do it. And if being a pastor means being available to a group of people, which you are, and being a shepherd to a group of people, you want to do that long term, you've got to have times when you are not available to people and you are not their shepherd.
Stanley Hauerwas said that pastors turn themselves into quivering masses of availability.
Yeah, bro.
Quivering masses of availability. Yeah. That you just sort of like bend to people's needs and wants and just sort of give in to that and just make yourself available to any and all. And like there's a gift in limits, like you're talking about, in receiving
100%.
that and recognizing that and trusting in the goodness of God to fill in that space.
Well, and trusting in the goodness of God in you as you are, because another bit of the book, like you're the gift you're giving to your people. That's it. You're the gift you're giving. And if you can give a healthier version of yourself, please do that. Because the folks who are the quivering masses of availability, let's be honest between you and I, like those are the good ones. Those are the good ones among us who are like, they're so available because they so deeply love the Lord and they love these people. And so they're constant. Those are the good ones. The other ones who aren't so good have whole other sets of issues. So that desire in you to be that kind of available to people, that is a really, really good desire. Let's get you in a place in which you can do that well and fully. And being fully available doesn't mean being available all the time. It means being unavailable enough that you are in touch with yourself and with God, so that when you're giving yourself to people, you are fully available.
So good. That's good. That's gosh, I think we could talk about this for a long time. But that's a good one for us to close out on. Like, tell the people where they can find you, find all the stuff that you're putting out,
Sure.
Pay attention to you.
With the book specifically, if you go to sacredstrides.com, apparently we own that, which is great. That's a launching point. I didn't know. I just saw it. I was like, that's my website. If you go to sacredstrides.com, that's a place where you can launch off and like find the book wherever you want to find books. But I am available just by my name, Justin McRoberts, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or at justinmcroberts.com.
Awesome. Sacredstrides.com. I'll throw that up in the show notes. And
thanks, man.
Bro, it was so good to have you here. I'm really grateful
Absolutely.
We got a chance to connect on this, and I'm really grateful for what you're putting out in the world. That genuinely, the book is a gift, and I hope it's really helpful for a lot of people.
Dude, thank you. Seriously. I mean that. Thanks for pushing through and making it happen.